Hello and welcome to the 7th lecture in the module Reason and Persuasion. This week I want to talk about the logics of different academic areas. So what does that mean? Well, so far we've been talking about logic and reasoning and persuasion as if there were only one activity regardless of which subject matter you're talking about. As if reasoning about trees and stars would go the same way as reasoning about wars and books, right? And maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. So there are some people who think that there is just one discipline called logic, one activity called reasoning, which really is the same, has the same deep down logic regardless of what you're talking about. There are other people who think that there is a different way of thinking involved in the natural sciences than there is in the humanities, right? And the suggestion I'm going to make to you is that in the humanities there's something about contextualizing, adding detail, making connections that explains whatever it is you're trying to explain, whereas in the mathematical sciences or the exact sciences, something like the reverse happens. In order to explain something, you strip away detail, you isolate the event from its context, the better to see the mathematical model that explains what's going on. So you don't have to believe that, you only need to consider it. This is important not only for questions about logic and methodology, but also as a way of doing metaphysics. Because if the methods that you should use rationally, rigorously, to investigate human activity in human culture are the same as the methods you should use to investigate natural events like earthquakes and the growth of lichen on rocks, then maybe that's because on metaphysical level they are the same kind of process, right? Maybe they're the same kind of process because they're the same kind of thing. So if there is no deep division between nature and culture, or if you prefer between matter and mind, between physical matter and mental events, then maybe the same methods should be used to investigate them. On the other hand, if it turns out that trying to investigate nature on one hand and culture on the other gives us the experience that actually they need different sorts of methods, well, maybe that might suggest to us that they are different sorts of processes made up of different sorts of things. So what we say about methodology in the different parts of the university has a bearing and might be informative about the metaphysical disputes that go on not just in philosophy of mind but elsewhere as well. Think of it this way: if we're monists about substances or about metaphysics, if we're monists in our metaphysics, if we think there's only really one kind of stuff connected by one kind of connection or one kind of relationship, then there should really be only one kind of method for investigating it. But if there's more variety in the different kinds of stuff, or the different kinds of relations, or the different kinds of process, if our ontology is richer, if our metaphysics is richer, then the range of methods we should expect to be richer as well. And the way I think of it is we have access to methodologies, right? We can go and look and see what the historians are doing, and we can go and see what the physicists are doing, and we can compare them. So we have access to methodology, whereas we don't have easy access to the things that metaphysics talks about. So looking at methodology, doing a kind of natural taxonomy of methodologies might tell us something metaphysically significant. That's part of what's in play in this question about whether there's one logic or many logics, whether there's one logic for all subject matters or different logics for different subject matters. Okay, I want to offer you some distinctions. There's a traditional one between ought and is. Right, so Hume, we've already met David Hume, who produced that counter-argument against Paley's watch analogy. Hume is famous, amongst other things, for insisting that you can't get an ought from an is, that you can't get a statement about how things ought to be from any number of statements about how things are. So to put out in terms of logic, in terms of arguments, if you have a conclusion about how things ought to be, then there needs to be at least one premise about how things ought to be. Now, not everybody agrees with this. Hegel, for example, just to name one famous philosopher, doesn't agree that there's an absolute distinction between ought and is. Nevertheless, it's a distinction that is real, even if you don't think it's absolute. So even those philosophers like Hegel, who think that the distinction between how things ought to be and how they actually are doesn't go all the way down, as it were, do recognize that science is one kind of inquiry and ethics is another. I mean, he wrote different books on them. So you have the is-ought distinction. Next, you've got a distinction that we've already met when we were talking about Aristotle and the four causes. There's a distinction between causes and purposes. So if you think about two rocks, one of which is a pebble picked up off the beach that's been rubbed smooth by the actions of wind and wave, and the other is a prehistoric stone tool that has a sharp edge because somebody napped it. Nap is a fine verb. You nap flint. So somebody's chipped off bits of flint to create a sharp edge. With the first case, with the pebble, you can ask what caused it to be the shape it is, but there's no sense asking what's the purpose, what's the point. Whereas with the stone tool, the flint tool, the best explanation for why it's that shape will involve its purpose. So human artifacts have final causes. They have, you can ask what's the purpose of them, whereas natural objects don't. Okay. Another distinction that you want to bear in mind, that you want to have handy, is between the inside and outside of an action. So this is something, this kind of language comes from R.G. Collingwood, who's a philosopher of the first half of the 20th century. So every action has an inside and an outside. If somebody's doing something, there's what it looks like to an observer, and then there's the point of view of the person doing it. And one way in which this distinction can make a difference is in the explanations. So when you explain your own actions, very often you mostly point to the circumstances, right? You know, I had to steal that car. I was being chased by bad guys who wanted to do me in. I didn't have any options. Stealing that car was the circumstances were such that I had no option than to steal that car, and that's the explanation. The circumstances explain the action. Somebody else might look at the same events and say, yeah, he's just the kind of person who would deal with that situation by doing something mad like stealing a car. That's entirely in character for him. Okay, so that's the inside-outside distinction. Finally, there's a distinction between separation and relation. So here's one view of distinctions. If you draw a distinction, the question is, does there need to be any relation between the things distinguished? So if you distinguish between England and Peru, say, well, England's one country, Peru is another. But there is a view that whenever you make a real distinction, you establish a relationship. So, for example, if you distinguish between England and Scotland, well, what does it mean to be Scottish? A big chunk of what it means to be Scottish is not being English, and similarly, part of what it means to be English is not being Scottish. Neither England nor Scotland have that kind of relationship with Peru. So on this view, a real distinction is one that establishes a relationship. So you might distinguish birds that perch from birds that wade, so the shapes of their feet, but they're all birds. And that's a distinction within the genus or the category of birds. But if you distinguish birds that perch from the dreams of civil servants, that's not a distinction, that's just a kind of arbitrary juxtaposition. I've just gone for, the two things that look weirdest next to each other, perching birds and the dreams of civil servants. You are in no danger of confusing them because they're not in the same category. So he didn't really need them to be distinguished. So there's an idea that whenever you draw a distinction, at the same time, if it's a real distinction, if it's a distinction worthy of the name, you at the same time create a relation. So what you can do now as a little exercise is go back over the previous distinctions that I just drew. So between the is-ought distinction, the inner-outer distinction, the purposeful and the causal distinction, and ask yourself whether this last thought about distinctions and relations applies to them. How do those first three distinctions change if you apply that last thought to them?